Okay, for our next case study, we have a 31-year-old man, originally from Ecuador. He vomited what appeared to be a long worm-like object. The object was 27 centimeters in length. You can do your conversion if you really want. The object was sent to pathology for sectioning and staining. So again, what I'm going to show you is going to be a cross-section of the worm that has been sliced, obviously it's cross-section, and stained. And you have to tell me what it is. So immediately, just based off of the size of this worm, you should have a little bit of clue about what it could be or what it couldn't be, because not many worms are quite this big. Here are the pictures. So here's the worm itself. This is a cross section, and frankly, I don't really care about figures B and C, but I want you to look at what's inside here. Look at these eggs. And you can kind of see that they have a unique shape and surface to them. And this worm is affectionately known as the Ascaris lumbricoides worm. Let's take a look. Ascaris lumbricoides is big. I think, let's see, it's about 30 centimeters to whatever this guy had, 22 to 35 centimeters, depending on if you're looking at the male or the female worm. You can see they're quite large on both sides. They cause infection that can basically lead to tissue damage, bacterial infection. When we look at the life cycle, it will make sense. Intestinal blockage and malnutrition. So these are really big. And if you get a very high worm burden, it's called, then you're going to have a hard time getting things absorbed, but really passing things through the digestive tract. You can see the buccal cavity here is kind of unique. And then again, this is sort of an image of many, many worms that someone had. Now their eggs are interesting. You can see here, these are all Ascaris lumbricoides eggs. And they have some similar characteristics and they have different characteristics. So if you look at the eggs that are at the top versus the ones at the bottom, and then if you compare them left to right, we're going to apply the words unfertilized, fertilized, corticated, and decorticated to these eggs. So unfertilized eggs include this one right here on the left. So both the top and the bottom eggs are considered unfertilized, and it should kind of make sense because we have seen unembryonated eggs before that look kind of messy inside because they haven't really started to form that organism. Whereas on the right, we have fertilized eggs. So you can see sort of the ball of cells that has been created after fertilization. Now on the top, we have corticated eggs. They have this outer layer of like albumin that's it's called mammillated or corticated, and it makes these little bumps. Sometimes that outer layer falls off and it looks decorticated. So what you need to know is that all of these eggs come from the same organism, because it'd be really easy to think that they are 4 different species when in fact they are all the same. So fertilized or unfertilized, corticated, decorticated. Pay attention. You can see that the egg itself is a little bit longer. Some of these over on the left are way longer than here, or skinnier, I guess I could say. And relatively like oval shape, I guess. You can probably guess this is going to be a stool specimen. I hope that makes sense. Mammillated is that other word for corticated. I should really move this word up here because they are synonymous. The next image is going to show you a very heavy worm burden. So this is someone's intestines that had just so many worms. I don't think that this person survived. It's pretty rough. But you can see that you can have many of these at one time. So the adult worms will live in the lumen of the small intestine. You can kind of see here. These can be diagnostic because you can see the actual worms, as this guy vomited one out. So it's possible to get one to the lab. The female will produce almost 200,000 eggs a day, which get passed in the feces. Now, some of the eggs are going to be fertilized and some of them won't. Unfertilized eggs will not cause infection. So essentially, when the eggs are passed, they need to sort of hang out in the environment to become infective. If an unfertilized egg is passed into the environment, it will not undergo development and it will not become infective. It can be diagnostic, right? You can see an unfertilized egg in the stool, but it's not going to be something that can actually cause infection because it doesn't develop into an organism. The fertilized eggs definitely are infective. So it takes about 18 days to several weeks for this infection or the infective stage to actually happen. You need to have ideal environmental conditions, so it should be moist and warm and kind of shaded. And when we are just interacting with the environment, we will take in the infective eggs. The larvae will hatch out of the eggs. They will invade the intestinal mucosa, and then they get carried through the liver to the lungs. So you can see if you look at that number 6 here, there's something called the liver-lung migration. When you have something in the small intestine, it hops on the hepatic portal vein, and then it will travel from the hepatic portal vein into general circulation. It'll go to the liver, basically. And then once it's in liver, it actually gets into general circulation where it goes to the lungs. Once it's in the lungs, essentially, it will climb up the bronchial tree and be coughed out. It will actually spend a little bit of time in the lungs. So it's like 10 to 14 days in the lungs where they mature. And then they penetrate the alveolar walls, ascend the bronchial tree into the throat, and then you swallow them. So that you cough them up and swallow them. It's quite wild. Once they get back to the small intestine, they will then develop into adult worms. So it's not just swallow the egg, hatch an adult worm in the intestine, lay the egg. It's swallow the egg, larvae develop, travel to the liver, jump in the bloodstream, head to the lungs, continue to develop, climb out of the lungs, up to the esophagus, back to the GI tract, and then become adults. That's a crazy one. And then when they are adults, they can lay eggs. The eggs can be fertilized. The eggs will then pass in the feces. So adult worms can live 1 to 2 years. So you could have these things for quite a while. And as I said, definitely heavy worm burdens can cause a lot of problems. When it comes to Ascaris, as I said, you're going to have GI symptoms, tissue damage, intestinal blockage, bacterial infection, GI symptoms, and of course there can be lung-related issues because they're going to have that time spent in the lungs. Now, one thing we haven't really talked about is what's called the cuticle of the worms, and the cuticle of the worms is just the outer skin. And sometimes you can actually see on the outside, maybe if I go back here, that they have sort of a pinkish, striated outer cuticle. And that cuticle is something that you don't necessarily see quite the same in other worms. These are big worms. These are quite large. And their eggs are pretty unique. All right. So Ascaris, if that doesn't haunt your dreams, nothing will, truly. Let's talk about the next one. 65-year-old female living in Northern California had a colonoscopy as part of just routine screening. There was any wild symptoms. And what they found was a foreign body. They took it out, and just like the other ones, they did cross sections of it and they stained it. And this is what they saw. So these are like side views, cross-sectional views of the worm. But what I really want you to focus on are what you can see here for figure B and then actually figure C. And I will give you a hint. Some of you have seen these on other slides, like really early, I think even in the Entamoeba section. You saw these eggs, and you knew they were something weird, but you didn't know what they were, and I told you what they were. You probably forgot. But they are whipworms. These are whipworms, trichuria. And we will talk about whipworms that invade your small intestine. We'll talk about the eggs. I'll show you what to look for. So here we have the whipworms. One of these is a male, one of these is a female. Can you guess which one is which? What did I tell you about male versus female worms? Size and shape. Left side is female, right side is male. Remember that males have a curly tail, and when you look at your slides, you're going to for sure see that. Here's another example of that. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that what you would expect to be the head or the anterior end of the worm, in fact, is the posterior end. So the anterior end is this skinny thread-like part of the worm, and then the posterior end is the big one. So it's called a whipworm because it looks like a whip. Like you have the handle, which is the thick part, and you have the long skinny part, which is strange. Now, if we think about what they do, the whipworms actually, sometimes they're called threadworms because they thread themselves into the lining of your stomach mucosa. And that causes irritation, and it actually can cause sloughing off of that interior lining. So it can be pretty nasty. And what we're looking at in the next picture here is the inner lining of the mucosa, the gut, that has those whipworms threaded in. So that anterior end that's very fine and skinny actually weaves its way into the gut, and that thick end is what sticks out. And that's what you're seeing here. So you would not see this in the lab, but if you were, doing a colonoscopy or observing one, you might see that if someone had it. For us, specimen of choice is stool. And I think I don't know if I've said that for all the other ones, but minus the first one we talked about, trichinella, really specimen of choice is stool. And these are the eggs. They're very unique. They stain really dark. They actually pull in some of the stercobilin, that like sort of bile-y stuff that we get that dark brown color from in our stool. And you can see they are unembryonated. They do not have a ball or a cluster inside of them, but they have something going on. They have 2 hyaline polar plugs, and they look kind of football shaped, right? They're sort of football shaped, and that's unique. So they have that real dark brown color. They have the hyaline plugs. They're pretty easy to see. They're unembryonated. Sometimes they look like a barrel. People say that. And as you might imagine, they show up in the stool pretty obviously. Now, when we have these organisms, symptom-wise, I'm just going to go back to this picture because it should make sense. Symptom-wise, you're going to see things like ulcerative colitis. So that's where you're having, you're getting layers of the inside of the gut sloughing off, forming those ulcers, those little bleeding ulcers. They can cause dysentery, so bloody diarrhea, anemia, because if you have an ulcer, sometimes you bleed, and that causes blood loss and anemia. There can be growth stunting and potentially secondary infection. So depending on when you get this, how long you have it, that secondary infection, you've got a lot of gut bacteria that can get into the ulcer and cause that. So very much abdominal. Not so fun. I mean, none of these are fun, right? Let's click past that here. So looking at the life cycle here, let's start at the top. We have our infective stage, which is the embryonated. So the embryonated egg is the one we need to eat to be infected. So you obviously contract that, you ingest that. After ingestion, the eggs will hatch in the small intestine. Oops, let me go back. And what will happen is the larva will then mature, and they essentially establish themselves as adults in the colon. The adult worms live in the cecum and the ascending colon. They are fixed in that location because they thread their anterior portions into the mucosa. They will mate. The eggs will become fertilized. The females will oviposit about 60 to 70 days after infection. Excuse me. And they leave about 3 to 20,000 eggs per day. That is horrible. Those eggs will be passed in the stool. Fecal oral contamination will result. We will ingest the egg, and the whole cycle repeats. So there's no liver-lung migration here. The only organism we've seen so far that does liver-lung is going to be Ascaris. So this is the whipworm, trichuria, and it is obviously going to cause that nasty little ulcerative colitis and a lot of intestinal upset. Not so fun. Not so fun. All right, so let's take a look at one more set of nematodes. This is a 2-for-1. We've got a 4-year-old admitted to the hospital with severe abdominal pain mimicking appendicitis. A small section of the bowel was removed and sent to the pathology department for workup, so a little biopsy, right? Section of the tissue was preserved in formalin, sectioned and stained. So again, not something you would necessarily see in the lab, but you might. This is the worm that's been sectioned. It's actually longitudinal there on the left. Images A through C, I didn't give you all of them, show what was observed at 100x. In addition to the biopsy, stool was collected for routine O&P. Figure D, which you can see on the right there, is what they saw in low numbers in a concentrated wet mount from formalin-preserved stool. What do you think it is? There are potentially 2 answers if you use just the egg, but there are maybe 2 answers if you use the worm, although I'm going to show you how to differentiate them. So you can pause and you can think about what it might be. Look at what we haven't covered yet. Or you can just say that these are hookworms. It could be Necator or it could be Ancylostoma. So we have Necator americanus and Ancylostoma duodenale, and they are two types of hookworm. And let's take a look at their eggs. We've got a couple examples here. Embryonated eggs. You can see there's lots of different stages represented, so lots of little cells. There's only 4 on the top left, and then you can see that there's more on the bottom. They have a very clean and clear, thin, colorless shell. And there's no mammillation. It's still kind of short and round, maybe a little bit oval, right? But this is what either of the Necator or Ancylostoma species eggs will look like. So from an egg perspective, they are indistinguishable. You cannot tell them apart. You may encounter faleriform larvae. There are different kinds. This is faleriform. It looks a lot like another worm we've seen before. Can you think of one that you might confuse with this? If you said Enterobius, that's a good thing to say because they kind of look like pinworms. They kind of look the same. If you were to see the faleriform larvae in this stool, which could happen, you are going to notice that it's not pinworm because it does not have that esophageal bulb like you would find in Enterobius vermicularis. Now, for the male and female of the hookworms, the males will have a copulatory bursa. So this is basically a reproductive structure that the males have, and that helps us distinguish them from the females. I do believe that the book makes a mistake in one of the captions of the pictures about which one is the male and which one is the female. But the male has the copulatory bursa, which is a structure used in reproduction, obviously. And as we look at the worms, the adult worms, so again, we're dealing with 2 different species of hookworm. We have Necator americanus and Ancylostoma duodenale. You got to look at their buccal cavity in order to know which one is which. And what you're going to see here is they have different kinds of teeth. They have sharp little pointy ones, or they have what are called cutting plates. So some species, Necator americanus specifically, has cutting plates, which are these rounded sort of sharp-edged teeth. And then Ancylostoma duodenale actually has like visible, sharp, pointy little shark teeth in here. So you're going to look for the teeth in Ancylostoma or the cutting plates in Necator. And please notice, these are obviously scanning electron pictures, so they're really nice. We're not going to have that. What you need to look at is the buccal cavity and look for these little sharp, pointy things. Okay, Ancylostoma here. I think they even look like the letter A upside down, right? A for Ancylostoma. And then Necator americanus on the left with the cutting plates. It's hard to see, and I believe that the images you see on your slides are going to kind of be from a side view, so you really have to focus in and out to see what shape those teeth are. The Necator egg is larger, but not enough to be helpful, I don't think. They can be found in geographical locations that are different. So Necator tends to be North and South America, whereas Ancylostoma is a little bit more ubiquitous. So, I mean, not super, super helpful, but how we get these is kind of unique. It should sort of remind you of the schistosomes a little bit. You will have the eggs, or the larvae, penetrating the skin. That's going to infect the human. So if we start at the top, you can see we have the faleriform larvae. Remember, faleriform larvae are going to be the infective ones, the ones that are like finding the next host. They will penetrate the skin, usually the feet, of the host. And once they get into the host, they will get into the skin, they will get into the blood vessels, they will get to the heart, and then they will get to the lungs. So they will penetrate the pulmonary alveoli, and then they will climb the bronchial tree, kind of like a scarus. It's a little bit different, where then they are swallowed. So it's foot to bloodstream to heart to lungs. It's a little bit different. It's not a liver-lung migration. It's a heart-lung migration, right? So it's general circulation, and then it climbs into the lungs. They climb up. We swallow them. The larvae reach the small intestine. They reside there. They mature there into adults. When they are adults, they will attach to the intestinal wall. So those teeth were not just for show. They actually bite and attach to the small intestine, where they essentially suck your blood. And oftentimes you become very anemic as a result. Most adult worms generally are gone after a year or two, but they can live for quite a while. They can kind of hang out there dormant in the intestine. Sometimes they make their way to the muscle. Either way, once the adult worms mate, they're going to pass the eggs in the feces, so diagnostic stage of the eggs. And then that's going to be out in the environment where the rhabditiform larvae will hatch. It will feed. It will grow. It will become filariform larvae, and then it will penetrate the skin. And obviously, the cycle repeats. So this one's even more unique than, some of the other ones. And this applies to either hookworm, Necator or Ancylostoma. They have slight differences in their life cycles, but not enough for us to really care about. So what's it going to feel like if you have these? Well, there can be lung symptoms, obviously, because there are time spent in the lungs. There can be a sore throat from that part where they get coughed up and swallowed. Coughing, wheezing, bloody sputum. Obviously, GI issues, diarrhea, anorexia, so like not eating, pain. There can be anemia, as I said, and then with loss of blood comes loss of protein, hypoproteinemia. So these are really nasty, and they can really take a toll. It's not like a tapeworm that just hangs out and you barely know it's there. These will actually significantly cause some damage. Now, where they penetrate the skin, you will get something called ground itch. And ground itch is just like the itchy feeling when the worms, it's like the allergic reaction essentially that happens when the worms penetrate the skin. And as I said, you can see some of those lung symptoms: sore throat, wheezing, cough, bloody sputum. It's a very unusual life cycle. And GI symptoms. Now, there are some like skin issues that can result, as you might imagine. This is called creeping eruption, and it is due to cutaneous larval migrans, or is also called cutaneous larval migrans, which is basically when a non-human hookworm gets into the tissues, right? And it's trying to get to its next place, but there's nowhere for it to go because we're a human and not its next host, whatever it may be. Kind of similar to swimmer's itch, right? The schistosome that gets into us and then dies, it's supposed to go into a duck. This is a very similar thing where that filariform larvae gets into us and then is like, oh shit, this is not my host, and then they die. So you have this itchy, creeping eruption. I mean, it looks creepy. You can actually see the worms in your skin in this picture, at least. So, all right, let's end this video here. We've got, I think, 2 more organisms to talk about, and then we're wrapping up the worms for the most part.